It's finally here. After nearly 2 years of waiting since playing the first beta, the First Descendant has launched. Day 1 has been decent. Some things have improved as I'd hoped, other stuff, honestly, I'm hoping gets put back in the oven to cook a bit more. Today we've grinded through the first 15 hours of the game to get you all the info on how to get started. If you want the best how to start tutorial, you've come to the right place. We clocked in several hundred hours on each beta, so mainly this live launch was to see what has changed for me. To be clear, this is an introduction to all the game systems you can use to become stronger or gain access to new tools. First things first, go to your settings, audio, voice always active, and change it to off. You'll thank me later. Yep, voice activity is always on by default. I don't know why. Also, change your FOV to 120 if you want to feel faster, but more importantly, see more enemies and mechanics on your screen. Now, we'll be looking into picking your first Descendants, how to acquire more Descendants, where ultimate Descendants come from, how to get materials for upgrading and crafting weapons, leveling and rerolling weapon stats, legendary weapon trait mechanics, and specific super strong purple tier early game weapons to look out for. Next, we'll look at the Reactor and external component system, how they impact your character, and the mastery rank system, which is tied to your overall gear progression. Then we'll finally look at the modding system, which is your main power scaling and what quirks to pay attention to, as well as the ability augment system and module capacity mechanics. We'll discuss what happens when a Descendant reaches level weapon 40 and how Crystallization Catalysts work. Finally, we will look at gunplay mechanics and including leveling up, amorphous materials, and void intercepts, which to Warframe players, this is basically grabbing relics and popping relics. There's also void fragments and encrypted vaults, so let's get started. When you first start the game, you get to pick from 3 Descendants, Viessa, Ajax, and Lepic. Don't worry, there is no bad choice, they buffed all 3 of these since the beta. Now, none of them stand out in the endgame either, they're all reasonably good as is, so I would say pick the one that you're most interested in. Of note, Viessa has movement speed increase for faster traversal and decent smaller AoE ability damage that can also freeze and hold choke points. Ajax can place barriers, damage reflects, and bubble shields, and with one of his new augments, finally has access to a grouping ability. Lepic is basically a soldier with grenade abilities and a mid to long range DPS nuke tool with the highest firepower of the initial 3 choices. He also has access to a suck by default. But how do you get more Descendants? Well, you take a TP in Albion and talk to Anise, I don't know one of them, but they need to stop naming these NPCs in an easily memeable format. Anus, I'm looking at you. Anyways, she's your researcher for basically any craftable gear in the game. Be it new Descendants or weapons, their ultimate variants or enhancement mats, it's all here. You'll see I have a legendary weapon crafting here already. Many of these Descendants and weapon parts are obtained from just playing repeatable instance content, like dungeons and overworld enemy camps, but then you have to crack it open like a Warframe relic to get one of the items inside randomly later by doing matching void intercept fights. I can see the full list of drops from an activity by alt scrolling. But let's get back to the researching screen. If you want to track a research item you're farming, press F to see its component sources. It'll tell you where the crafting materials come from. You can then press again to track the materials themselves. Ultimate Descendants in particular come from later world zone dungeons and instances and require killing the later void intercept bosses to obtain the amorphous material, which is basically an RNG treasure chest. Ultimate weapons are a lot easier to acquire and earlier too. Now, anything you craft in general is done at this NPC and takes a variable amount of time, though typically measured only in a few minutes to a couple of hours. Early on, your main limiting resource will be weapon dismantle mats for bringing other weapons up to your current fighting level. You can lock a certain amount of items by pressing U. I don't know why they called it registering them, it's kinda confusing. Now, holding shift will select everything you do not have selected as locked for junk, and control will dismantle all junk. This works for all gear menus. Note that no weapons are locked by default, not even legendary weapons, so always look before you select all and dismantle. For the next part, all weapon upgrades and vendor stuff is located at this spot in Albion. Overworlds can have workbenches too. Now, the first 30 to 50 hours, you'll constantly be finding higher level loot to use. Weapons currently drop up to level 100, but will take a while to reach. This is normally the best way to maintain power growth without investing much resources. However, certain weapons may be stronger than expected or tickle your fancy. Unfortunately, weapons do not get naturally stronger by using them. Now, my main recommendations about weapon classes is this. Always have one shotgun and one sniper you want to use in your backpack waiting. Many harder encounters are much more comfortable with a heavy weapon, but because of their limited ammo, then you will not be able to use them all the time. Certain fights make sniper rifles or shotguns near useless, so having both lets you pick and choose. For accuracy kills, scout rifles and hand cannons are king in this game, both with probably some of the best feel and high damage. Assault rifles and SMGs are your main fodder hosing tools, and the rest are to your taste. Beam rifles are good at chipping shoulder pads off of enemies that have armor bars, whereas trace rifles are essentially a 3-round burst. While legendary weapons are shiny and look quite strong, there are some really good purple tier weapons that give them a run for their money in the early to mid game, as well as scaling into late game. The following are weapons I would seriously recommend not dismantling or selling and keeping them for later weapon level syncing for harder content as you go through your first 100 levels. First, this scout rifle, Silly Weeper. I don't remember if it started dropping in Sterile Lands or Vespers, but this thing is nuts. Do you want a scout that does half the damage of a sniper, but shoots as fast as a full auto sniper, but has 10 times the ammo max capacity and gets much more ammo per pickup? This weapon, with this garbage build, at just about level 40, easily hits over 50k on headshots. This alone has carried me through so many encounters without needing to get up close and personal, and is also handy for void intercept fights. The fire rate is just slow enough to not worry about recoil. You can even mod fire rate onto it if you so choose. It has an amazingly clean scope with the red dot, sounds and feels good to use, and is just busted in DPS. Now, this other weapon is the Assassin's Edge, broken in CBT1 and CBT2, and I can confirm it is still busted in Live 1.0. You can get this one as early as Kingston and Sterile Lands, the first 2 zones. It has absolutely monstrous base crit at 40%. Decent fire rate with 9 shots in mag with a good feel, it will take you extremely far. Now, if you want an early assault rifle that scales well with crit, we have Red Eye. This drops very early in Sterile Lands and Vespers. It's a decent interim before looking for late game assault rifles, however, they feel kind of same-ish. You also gain access to Thunder Cage, a legendary earlier on, and it comes from a quest, so everybody gets it guaranteed, so I would normally recommend trying that instead. One specific thing to note, do not use the Last Night shotgun. I don't have one here because I've scrapped them all, but its DPS is misleading. It has low damage per shot, high fire rate. You burn your ammo very quickly to deal barely any more damage than a normal shotgun and thus reload often. Now, it would be good if there was a way to get plenty of shotgun ammo so you can use a quickfire, lower damage shotgun against trash fodder. But heavy ammo is hard to come by in this game. Use literally any other shotgun. Personally, I prefer In a Blink at the moment, which I got in Echo Swamp and Egna Desert. It combines above normal fire rate with above average mag size and also above average damage per shot. Plus, it looks cool. Shotguns can feel same-ish, so until you get a legendary one, just pick what you like. So, for leveling and rerolling weapons, these are your 2 main ways to make them better besides the modding system. There is a level syncing method via weapon level transmission and a weapon readjustment. The first one uses a sacrificial weapon as fodder to bring a desired weapon up to the same level as the sacrificial weapon. Purple weapons cost phase exchangers and legendary tier weapons cost precision phase exchangers to do these. These are researchable items with Anise, which costs, you guessed it, weapon dismantle materials. Now, as you progress further in the game and an incremental weapon level slowdown, you'll start selling some fodder weapons at this vendor for gold, which will become one of your limiting resources alongside Kuiper shards. Otherwise, early game much prefers dismantling. For reactors and external components, you can safely dismantle everything you don't use until your progression slows down a lot. Mid to late game is when you start caring about extra copies of reactors and components. Don't worry, they'll get replaced super fast at the moment. Now, the other system for weapon progression is weapon adjustment. All this does is reroll the randomized stats on the weapon. Only use this on gear you intend to use a long time, and only on purple and gold weapons. This works similar to weapon level syncing, except doesn't need a sacrificial weapon. You pick your desired weapon to alter, use crafting materials, this time adjustment control axes, another researchable item, to reroll the bonus stats. You can see all the random stats allowed on the left as well as their RNG stat range. You can also even log stats you want to keep, and that's that. Weak point and Colossi damage are really good for void intercept fights. Firearm attack is universal, crit substats are only useful for certain scout rifle snipers and other rifles that, well, TLDR, if the weapon doesn't have at least 20% crit, it's not worth using crit mods or crit substats. Certain gimmick weapons with specific elemental reactions will appreciate substats of the same element as well. Now, speaking of legendary weapons, they each have a unique ability that can also be enhanced at this workbench. This one is the most simple. You craft extra dupes of the same legendary weapon and feed them in to buff the special trait. That's it. Also, if you want a full breakdown of your entire gear loadout on your weapons that you use, as well as your resistances and scaling damage for your abilities on your Descendant, click this button. That's shown at the bottom of your screen, whatever your key button is set to. Finally, there's the Reactor upgrade part, which leads into our next section. The main purpose of this is granting ability damage and melee damage. Melee is sub-attack in this game, and outside of specific mod interactions or unique Descendant kits, melee by itself sucks. The shitty melee hit does 0 damage, and every once in a while you'll have a charged up version that is your last resort and has a cooldown but gives good DPS. How early you should level this depends on how much your Descendant cares about ability damage. The scaling isn't too high, and you gain much more scaling from just using a higher level reactor, so you don't need to worry about this much for now. Materials for this come from dismantling reactors and components. So let's talk about actually gearing reactors and external components. Reactors are simple. You want to match the elemental reactor to your Descendant's element so their abilities deal more damage. They grant ability damage and melee damage. Purple tier and up reactors have an extra optimization condition, meaning if you equip weapons that match the task, you get, in this case, 140% scaling of the skill power bonus up top instead of the 100% listed scaling. For weapon platform Descendants, this isn't as important, but for ability DPS Descendants, this is extremely important. The skill power boost ratio is universal on all reactor types. The first line will always match the element of the reactor name, so just get the right reactor and you don't need to worry about this. The second line is RNG and randomly picks one of 4, or well, non-type would be 5th, but it's 4 subtypes and whatever it's called. Abilities in this game can have a second classification besides just elements and non-element. This can be the normal type, tech type, fusion type, singular type, and something else I can't remember. Basically, if you hover over your Descendants abilities, you can see what element and what subtype they fall under. On the reactor screen itself, you can see a summary version of your 4 abilities and what element as well as subtype they fall under. If the ability matches the reactor, the nodes will light up for each condition. The skill power boost ratio in your reactors are very important, so listen carefully. Anything in the game that includes the word boost ratio is a final multiplier to your stats that applies after everything else. This is a very hard stat to acquire in the game with only a few mods and very few gear that gives it. If you're going ability DPS, you will always want to use as much of boost ratio gear and stats as you can get. Yes, reactors can get randomized stats too, but those are way more annoying to reroll and farm, so I wouldn't worry too much about these for a long time. You already need the right reactor element with the right subtype and right bonus optimization conditions to drop for endgame. For external components, I'll give you the simple TLDR. They can have main stats and then randomized stats and set effects. The set effects ones are super rare and hard to farm, and most of the early ones you get access to are not that good, so don't worry about them. All you need to know is that defense is king. None of the other stats are good enough to matter in how much components give you. There are niche situations for specific builds that might want other stats, but if you don't know where to start, always pick the defense main stat pieces. This is what will keep you alive from getting swarmed in harder content, as well as being able to tank hits and void intercepts. Modding is very expensive quickly, especially earlier on, so this is your only way to get decent defensive stats earlier. Alright, let's talk the mastery rank system. This is where you can upgrade it in Albion. Mastery rank determines how much mod costs you can fit on builds, as well as mod slots available to even use on equipment. It also increases your inventory limit, storage limit, and shape stabilizers, which is the one thing I don't really remember what it's for. So how do you get mastery rank points? Every time you use a piece of gear, you gain proficiency. Now this is a one-time thing. Weapons and Descendants can go up to 40 proficiency from using them. It carries across all variants of the same name, so if I sell a Viessa or this Scout and I get another one later, they will still have the same proficiency as the last time I used them. Resetting ranks on gear and Descendants will not let you get more proficiency either. It is still a one-time thing. This means you need to use more unique named gear and Descendants that acquire more gear proficiency, which translate 1-to-1 to mastery rank points. Get enough points and you can come back to this hand to rank up for more bonuses. Okay, now to get into the thick of the main game mechanic, modding. Modding is where 90% of your damage scaling comes from. If you don't mod, your damage will suck, that's it. Luckily, you can get by with the bare bones of modding until about level 60 to 80 equipment range. Then you will actually need to start modding properly. You don't even need fully built mods though until way past level 100. If you're from Warframe, you'll be right at home. For those that never played, modding essentially equips cards that give stat buffs to your weapon. These can range from base damage, fire rate, magazine size, crits, reload, elemental damage, final damage multipliers, and other unique effects. To level up mods, you'll need to go to Cillian, the K-pop looking dude on this side of Albion. Enhancing mods cost gold and Kuiper shards at an exponential rate per mod rank. However, most mods only have linear growth, so normally you want to level your mods you use evenly, rather than paying an exorbitant price just to rank a few up super high. Dismantling modules is extremely important as your main secondary source of Kuiper shards for upgrading mods, otherwise they just drop from killing people. Basically, every few hours you play, come here, hold shift to select duplicate mods and dismantle all selected. Every mod has a number up top and a shape. This number determines how much capacity it will use to equip, and the shape is the socket type. Most gear do not have socket types by default, but if you look at my Viesa, you can see this C shape. If I play this 10 cost mod over it with the same socket type, it will only use half the capacity instead. Adding more socket types to slots reduce the cost of mods is how you end up with full builds in endgame. Hovering over the mod obviously tells you what it does. On guns, firearm damage and some kind of elemental damage will always be present as your mandatory stuff, and crit viable weapons with base 20% or higher, which can use those mods, and you can see by pressing tab to see base stats without mods. Weak point mods are good for bossing and Colossi fights, and the rest like recoil, fire rate, reload, mag size all depend on the weapon, and you can mix and match to your tastes. Know that there are modding restrictions that prevent you from putting more than one of the same kind of mod category on at once. For example, I cannot equip 2 different elements. The restrictions can get weird, so I'll let you figure it out for yourself. Remember that your module capacity limit is determined by your mastery rank. Modding Descendants is very similar, except instead of firearm damage and elements and all the reload and stuff, you mod for stats like strength, duration, range, and efficiency, which is cast and channel costs of your abilities, to alter the effectiveness of your kit. There are a few unique things in the modding system I'll go over next. On both weapons and Descendants, you can increase module capacity not only by increasing mastery rank, but also by installing an energy activator. This adds 30 extra capacity to the weapon or Descendant. Most gear can only do this once. Energy activators are research from Anise again, and require an extensive amount of material research farming. I wouldn't worry about this too much right now. You don't need to put reactors on anything before level 100 for your weapons, unless you really like them. In current game balance, energy activators are just for min-maxing or pushing content that massively outscales you super early. Otherwise, you don't need to care about it until well into endgame. You'll amass these more over time and will be able to use them more often. Now, certain Descendants will also have red modules of which they can equip, and these are called skill modules fitting in the green slot. These are basically augments that alter the effect of abilities on their kit. Do not blindly throw these on. First of all, they're not just straight up upgrades, they change functionality. They're insanely expensive to equip, leveling them makes them cheaper, but it is still expensive in capacity. Some of them will go against your desired playstyle or are straight up not designed well, so please read augments before you equip them. The other orange slot is for sub-attack mods. This is basically your melee mod slot. Always equip something here. Sub-attack mods grant bonus capacity instead of consuming it. So this 4, I get an extra 4. For those from Warframe, no, formatting this slot doesn't make it give double, it makes it give plus 5 extra. So a max rank will give plus 15 instead of 10 when you put a Crystallization Catalyst over it. Don't bother formatting this before the expensive mods that cost more than 10 capacity. Now, for the Warframe bros crystallization stuff, this is Forma. For everyone else, this is a researchable item, again, that resets the rank of your Descendant or proficiency of your weapon from 40 to 0. Keep in mind, this is separate from weapon level. It can only be used at proficiency 40. No, it does not let you get mastery rank points from gear a second time. Its purpose is to add a new socket type so that you can have the cost of a matching socket mod that you slot in. This is a tedious grind that functions as the endgame gearing besides randomized stat rerolling on weapons. You do not need to do this before level 100, and an energy activator granting plus 30 capacity cap is much more useful and important first. Save these crystallization stuff for your favorite Descendants and weapons. Also note that energy activators and crystallization stuff does not carry across weapons and Descendants of the same type. It sticks to that specific item, so scrapping it and getting future copies of the same gear will not have them anymore and will waste the ones you invested. Okay, so what about Void Intercepts? To be clear, this is not the endgame. Void Intercepts are considered mid-game, and devs have already confirmed they're looking into doing proper actual endgame raids and stuff in the future. So see these fights as a standard to bridge the gap towards harder content and future updates. This is where you learn how boss mechanics work. Each fight is typically designed with a gimmick to teach you more about the game. But why do we actually kill these bosses? Two main reasons. The first is several are tied to story progression and you will not be able to access new zones until you kill them. Second, these bosses are the only way to open up amorphous material, which you got from instance dungeons and overworld enemy camps. Opening amorphous material is the only way to get ultimate weapon or ultimate descendant part blueprints, or even normal descendant part blueprints. That's also the main way to get crystallization catalysts and energy reactor blueprints. So expect to fight these a lot in the future. Not all materials can be opened at all times. If you want to see what amorphous material the boss can open, however, you can hover over these, of which ones you own will have a check mark. Now, if you want to see the reverse for which bosses can be fought to open your amorphous material you own, just hover over it in your inventory. Some of the earlier fights can be done solo, but once you reach Devourer, it is strongly recommended to run it in a 4-man team only. There's public and private matchmaking, but mechanics functionality, like how many destructible objectives or weak points spawn, are not scaled down to party size, though boss HP and mechanic HP will be scaled to party size. To make these fights easier, I strongly recommend following the elemental info on the sidebar. These bosses deal a ton of their respective damage type. Run the appropriate element resistance on your Descendant. You do not need as high as it lists. For example, I cleared Dead Bride with only 1.2k chill resist and probably could have gotten away with 800. But not running any resistance at all in harder fights is literally suicide, especially because later bosses apply dots. Mod for their weakness type for bonus damage, of which, for example, Dead Bride is weak to fire. These fights progress quite similarly. Most early ones have no crazy mechanics and are just DPS bosses and shooting weak points to deal more damage. Now, grappling a yellow weak point and yanking it off will stun the boss for a bigger DPS window. Bosses will enrage when the bar below their health fills, of which they become invincible, and you can either wait or try and destroy the blue and pink vials that stick out from their body early. If you want to run down on some of the more annoying boss mechanics, I do have full Void Intercept playlists from the previous beta, including several less obvious boss mechanics, of which remain unchanged in version 1.0. The scalings of some bosses have changed, but mechanics are the same as before. Now, finally, in the overworld, you might notice these Void Fragment thingies. They're mainly used to get some mod drops, more weapons, but most importantly, Void Shards. Void Shards are needed to run the other Void mission in the overworld, destroying Void fusion reactors at Vulgus camps. These can drop rare augments for Descendants at about 1-2% chance, rare gold mods, and most importantly, a semi-reliable way to farm the super important rare elemental ability DPS Descendant mods and dual stat mods for ability nuke setups. There are also unmarked parts of the map with funny little encrypted vaults you can do a minigame at. I'll admit, I don't really know what they give right now, nor where to farm the item needed to get attempts at opening them, but keep these in mind. Alright, that's it for the beginner's guide to the First Descendant. I hope today's video was useful for you and had all the info you needed. If you have any questions, do feel free to leave them in the comments. I'll be actively streaming this game almost every day, so you might be able to get your question answered sooner if you ask me while I'm live. Cheers! If this is your first time watching, feel free to leave a like or better yet subscribe. Stick around if you want to see interesting videos on a nearly daily basis. You don't miss out on any of that, do you? That'll be it for this video. Thank you all for watching and see you all next time.